Fair warning, this video is going to have some big spoilers for Deltarune chapters 3 and 4. Mostly 3. It's a great game, go play it, and don't let me be the one to spoil you on it. Okay, I'm Dan, and I wasn't planning on ever making any Deltarune videos. I'm supposed to be a game dev and tech channel, but I love the chapters a lot, and I want to share my thoughts. And I want to get this theory out quickly because I haven't really seen anyone talk about this interpretation, or at least provide any solid arguments for it that I found. You've been warned for spoilers. I'm going to talk about some crazy stuff, so click away. Okay. The special boss of Deltarune Chapter 3 is the Roaring Knight, which is the most unique of all the special bosses that drop a Shadow Crystal, in that it is actually mandatory and allows you to lose to progress the story, which most people would have done. Now, if you win this battle, surviving one last major attack, then you get a special cutscene, which I'll play here. Now, apart from the fact that you get the Shadow Crystal and the Black Shard from that little chip off of the sword, the cutscene is left a bit vague. Now, most people would see this and think that the knight is slashing both Susie and Ralsei while they let their guards down. Some people would then think that KRIS surrenders to the knight by kneeling, but people who pay more attention realize that KRIS is actually getting knighted here, which is even proven by the file name of this sprite. But the fact that they're being knighted begs the question. Why is KRIS getting knighted here? And there's some other things that don't quite add up about this scene. In the normal version, Toriel is sleeping peacefully, but in this version, her face contorts to a nightmare. But why is doing a good job against and harming the boss somehow worse than getting one-shot? Doesn't really make much sense. So this leads me to my interpretation, which I also had the first time I actually played this. I think KRIS is the one who slashes Susie and Ralsei here, not the knight. And this act of betrayal is what actually gets them knighted. I mean, look, the slashes are clearly coming from the left. Need I say more? Yeah, I should probably say more. This is the KRIS Slash Theory. I really wanted to coin a theory name because those are fun, so KRIS Slash it is. So what is the evidence for this theory? Well, it heavily hinges off of the argument that KRIS is closely allied with the knight, which is something that a lot of people will already know that they'll pick up on by playing the game, but some people might not fully understand. So I'm going to start by presenting the evidence that shows that KRIS does have an allegiance to the knight, which culminates in this action of them slashing their allies and then getting knighted, because a strong motivation is definitely needed for them to do something like this. Then I'll break down the scene itself and the surrounding evidence to show why I think this is a strong interpretation. Okay, so what is KRIS's connection to the knight? This section might be obvious to some people, but maybe some others missed a lot of these details, so let's just get started. This is just to prove that KRIS does have an allegiance to the knight and is firmly on Team Knight, for whatever reason. I'm not going to go into the reason here. So, let's start with the evidence. The most obvious one, KRIS opens a dark fountain, leaving the door open for both the knight and Undyne to enter, which ends up happening as they both enter and the knight takes Undyne. They made the dark fountain on their own, despite just hearing a warning from Ralsei that if too many fountains are created, the roaring can happen. And plus, the dark fountain was planned in advance by KRIS the night before. Between chapters 1 and 2 during that night, they actually plugged in their TV, showing that they had some sort of plan to do this and they kind of knew about dark fountain creation before Queen explained it to them. And also, considering the knight's arrival into the dark world, how did the knight even know where the dark fountain was, unless they were told by KRIS or someone else with knowledge? They even get there before Undyne, who was directly called by Toriel. It's possible that they sensed the dark presence and rushed over, kind of like Ralsei does, but the more reasonable option is that someone, KRIS, could have told them, or that it was planned in advance. And also something interesting is that despite every dark fountain being different, according to Susie in Chapter 4, especially when made by different people, KRIS's Chapter 3 dark fountain still uses the same color palette and even has an eerily similar intro to Chapter 1's closet dark fountain. It's not a one-off spontaneous dark fountain creation done for fun. It's pretty similar to the previous dark fountains. The idea that KRIS might have been working on dark fountains before, or maybe even making them before, is supported by the dialogue from the creature that holds the Shadow Mantle, who says, "The knife grows dull without play." Kinda seems like the play from the old KRIS using a knife could have easily been them making dark fountains before. Now getting onto some of the more clear evidence that's definitely meant to make you think that KRIS is working with the Knight, we can start with the actual battle itself. KRIS takes less damage against the Knight boss than the other two party members. They also deal less damage to the Knight, unless both Susie and Ralsei are knocked down. There's an important detail in the fight which you only actually get if you no-hit the boss. Right before you deal the last blow, where the Knight is hurt and then ends the fight, there's a text box that shows that KRIS is giving a signal for the Knight to give up. You know, KRIS is hitting them with the, "It's not working, bro." KRIS also never tries to attack the Knight when we're not directly controlling them. This includes the cutscene where Susie confronts the Knight, and also later in Chapter 4, when the Knight is throwing a bunch of daggers at you. If you make it to the end of that hallway, KRIS just stands in front of the Knight, which Susie comments on before you get knocked down anyways. In Chapter 4, when you're trying to get the code for the shelter from Des's guitar, that's the moment when KRIS decides to rip out their soul, preventing you from seeing the shelter code, and then throwing you into a box in the closet. They really do not want you getting into the shelter. Then of course we have the phone calls, which is probably the most incriminating evidence. We see KRIS speaking on the phone with someone who's aware of the Dark Worlds and the Knight's actions and plans, including both the fountain at the church later that night, and also whatever the sacrifice is with Undyne. Now this is almost definitely Carol Holiday, seeing as how she arrives right after the phone voice says that they'll be right there. So this means that Carol is either working along with the Knight and KRIS, or that she is the Knight herself. Both are possible, but I'm not going to discuss which one I think is true just now. Another scene that most people wouldn't have gotten on their first try is when KRIS and Ralsei are talking to each other, and you have the option to close your eyes and think about what Susie's doing during Chapter 4 when she's getting the piano notes. If you refuse to think about Susie, you have the option to think about the Knight, but when you try to think about the Knight, just as they're about to take their helmet off, KRIS starts thinking about Jockington and other things that are not the Knight to try and dissuade you. After you see all the fountains in Chapter 4, and Susie and KRIS look around and there's no one there, they don't know where the Knight is, you have the option to go up to the closet door, and instead of opening it, you only have the option to turn the doorknob, which KRIS does not want to do anything more than that. Now it's kind of goofy to imagine the Knight just hiding in there, but maybe that's it. Maybe the Knight or someone else is hiding in that closet, and KRIS just does not want you to see them. If there's any other aspects of KRIS's connection to the Knight that I didn't mention, write them in the comments below. This game has so much detail, I wouldn't be surprised if I missed some. So with everything that happens in the first 4 chapters of Deltarune that we have, it's pretty clear that KRIS is working with the Knight when they're not being controlled by us. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, let's move on to the scene. Just kidding, I lied. Let's start with something before that scene instead. The biggest direct piece of evidence that supports the KRIS Slash theory happens in the secret S-rank minigames that you have to do before the special boss. To beat the special boss, you need the Shadow Mantle. Except you don't actually need it, it just makes the boss doable for normal people. And you get that from completing the S-rank minigames, a series of hidden and spooky minigames which are depicted as the true versions of the video games that Tenna has us play through in the game show. These minigames are pretty odd. They require you to level up your character by attacking monsters, which is always bad in these games. And to top it off, the monsters in these kinda look like Undertale characters, which is a bit weird. It also shifts over to being an allegory for the weird route, with the Ice Mage joining your party and freezing enemies that you previously couldn't kill. This is exactly what happens in the weird route, or the Snowgrave route, when you get Noelle to join you and start freezing enemies. Finally, in the third minigame, you start out with Susie and Ralsei following you, which is different from the other two. But once you get your sword, the only way to progress further is to attack Susie and Ralsei to level up. That's right, if KRIS is the one slashing Susie and Ralsei in the post-night cutscene, this is a direct foreshadowing and parallel to that. And right now, there is nothing else in this game, in the 4 chapters that are out right now, that parallel this action. It's direct foreshadowing, it doesn't link to anything else that's in the game right now. To me, this is very strong evidence that KRIS is the one slashing them. Now, you might be wondering, but the secret minigames are Weird Route allegations. Allegations? Oh god. Allegories. So maybe we will attack Susie and Ralsei later in the Weird Route. Which, first of all, this is still part of the Weird Route. This is just speculation from me, so it's okay if you think I'm a little bit off here, but I think that the Weird Route will require all 4 Shadow Crystals from chapters 1 to 4. Sham says that we will be able to use the Shadow Crystals from these chapters to create something we will enjoy, and there just so happens to be an item that we don't know anything about yet called the Pure Crystal, which is found in the Fuse options. But what does this get fused with? The Thorn Ring, a Weird Route exclusive item. I think the Twisted Sword is going to be necessary for the Weird Route, and the only way to get it is to get all the Shadow Crystals, which means you do have to do this cutscene where KRIS attacks Susie and Ralsei. Now your question might be, okay, well why would it also happen in the non-Weird Route? And I mean, yeah, that's a good point, but it's taking on the heavy assumption that everything in these secret minigames is only about the Weird Route. The only evidence even tying it to the Weird Route is from the second minigame where Noelle is freezing enemies. KRIS doesn't have to go around killing monsters and leveling up because KRIS can't even do that in this world. So the entire first part of the secret minigames isn't relevant to the Weird Route either. Anyways, either way, it's still a part of the Weird Route that KRIS would slash them, if KRIS slash theory is to be believed. Now there might be some other interpretations of why KRIS is attacking Ralsei and Susie in the minigames, but these would be predictions. This doesn't have a direct parallel in the games unless KRIS slash is true. So, is KRIS slash true? Let's move on to... I said it in the beginning too, but let's actually look at the visual effects of the slash. So you have the knight over here in ball form after getting damaged a lot and having part of their sword broken by Susie. Then, without any notice, a slash appears on the screen and the knight is gone. But the slash is clearly angled to be from the left to the right. It's pretty obvious that that's what this slash is. And look, I made a version of it where it's actually from the right to the left. Doesn't it just look more natural for what the knight would be doing? It's a simple change too. I mean, if I can do it, then Toby Fox could do it, the Deltarune Team could do it. Just flip the sprite. Now the fact that it starts from behind them doesn't mean that it has to be something from behind them that's attacking them, although I guess that could be an interpretation, especially with this dialogue in the fight. So maybe that's something to look into. But all this means with the slash going left to right is that there's a very wide slash arc that goes from the left to the right. And who's directly positioned on top of this who could make a slash like that? KRIS. The slash effects don't even reach where the knight was. The knight would have to first move all the way off screen to the left and then attack backwards. So my interpretation is that while Ralsei and Susie are distracted, KRIS slashes down Susie with the knight's technique, and then the knight backs up off screen. Then before Ralsei can do anything, they do the same to Ralsei. Next up, after Susie is killed by KRIS, or the knight, Ralsei looks shocked and then walks over, looking directly towards KRIS. Then he says, "How could you?" Now tell me, in what world would Ralsei ever say this if the knight just did like a normal fast attack? There's not anything really shocking about that. The knight was trying to do that the whole fight. What's so shocking about the knight doing that again? And why would Ralsei still be looking up at KRIS? I think the more obvious answer is that KRIS is the one who did it, and Ralsei is shocked and betrayed that KRIS would do it. Now the elephant in the room, and this is the most obvious counter evidence, why wouldn't Ralsei bring this up again? Obviously Susie wouldn't know because she got slashed instantly, but Ralsei would know that KRIS did this, right? So why wouldn't they bring it up? There isn't an obvious answer, but for me it's not clear evidence that KRIS slash is false, because, in my opinion, Ralsei already knows the difference between KRIS and the player. He has a lot of knowledge, and knowing about the entire prophecy, and also knowing about our soul, and how the game mechanics work, shows that Ralsei already kinda knows what our deal is. But he still needs us, the player, to fulfill the prophecy, so he's not gonna do anything about KRIS, right? He still needs us to work alongside KRIS to help seal the fountains. Now Ralsei's dialogue after the scene also, to me, seems to be talking to the player, calling us so brave. Because why would KRIS have been so brave if Susie was the one who ultimately stood up to the knight? She was the one talking during the fight and cracking off the Shadow Crystal. To me, this dialogue seems a lot more like Ralsei is commending the player's efforts in moving the soul and defending the party, rather than anything KRIS did themselves. Now, I could get it if there were arguments made that Ralsei's reaction here is unintentional, but this next evidence point doesn't make any sense to me if we assume that the knight is the one slashing, and that's Toriel. So the difference in dialogue: when we lose to the knight, Toriel is sleeping peacefully, but when we beat the knight, at least partially, Toriel's face contorts to a nightmare. That's right, if we get one shot, if we lose in one round, if we do terribly, Toriel sleeps peacefully. Why would her reaction go from neutral to bad if we do well? If we actually perform well and proved ourselves as strong against the knight? Why would that be so much worse than doing terribly? This makes no sense if we just got slashed by the knight normally. And I don't think KRIS getting knighted here is sufficiently bad for this reaction. But if this is a subconscious reaction to KRIS betraying the heroes, it makes all the sense in the world. Okay, finally, and most importantly, the fact that KRIS gets knighted here. Once again, this is proven by the file name of these sprites. So what's happening here? Well, KRIS is getting promoted to knighthood, which in Deltarune should have a tie to the prophecy, right? The knight being the one who creates the fountains, who opposes the heroes. So why would KRIS be knighted if they did nothing to earn that? You know, KRIS already has ties to the knight. Why are they only getting knighted now and in the optional route where this slash happens? So now, I'm going to tell you why KRIS becomes a knight here, and there's 3 main reasons. First of all, they create a dark fountain. This is a new isolated dark fountain which I talked about before, and this is progressing towards the roaring like the knight would have done. Just the fact that they're creating a dark fountain in the first place, but also that it directly services the knight's plans. Second, and I haven't seen this one talked about that much, KRIS is acting as the roaring knight to further their plans. What do I mean by this? Tenna explains before his boss fight that he had a deal with the knight to keep the 3 heroes busy, right? And during this scene it also shows the real world TV with the smile, but hang on, that doesn't make any sense for this to be the same roaring knight that we fight. The fact that it's the TV itself means this would have had to have happened before the dark fountain enveloped everything, right? Because otherwise it would just be Tenna, like normal Tenna. This reads like someone turned the TV on and spoke to it before opening the fountain, or in the process of opening it. But wait, Tenna says it's the roaring knight, right? It's definitely not KRIS, it's the roaring knight. Well, I think it's pretty close to being confirmed that KRIS is the one who made this deal with Tenna. This is shown in the S-rank minigame dialogue. Tenna says, "I did what you asked me to." Tenna's talking to KRIS about their deal. KRIS is the one who made the deal with Tenna. And once again, this is that 3rd S-rank minigame, the same minigame. And this is how you get the Shadow Mantle. They want you to see this before beating the knight and seeing this special scene. KRIS is the one who Tenna calls the roaring knight because they're the one giving them instructions on what the knight wants. This plays into this second action of KRIS's that I mentioned before, which is they are acting as the roaring knight, directly. Tenna calls KRIS the roaring knight. I don't really see any other way to take this scene. And then finally, the 3rd condition that grants them knighthood is that they slash the heroes with the swoon, just like the knight does. This is directly fulfilling the prophecy of opposing the heroes strife by strife. So you have in 3 different ways that KRIS has acted as the knight and opposed the heroes. With these 3 factors combined, KRIS is officially knighted, which means KRIS is now the knight of the prophecy alongside this roaring knight. I think now there's pretty much 2 of them. So let's wrap it up then. It all adds up. KRIS slashes Susie and Ralsei while they're distracted with the weakening knight. This ultimate betrayal, foreshadowed by the S-rank minigames, grants KRIS the status of knight from their partner, the roaring knight. The betrayal leaves Ralsei shocked, and even an unaware and unconscious Toriel distraught, whereas Ralsei afterwards does his best to encourage the player, but comes face to face with the difficulties that lie ahead. We saw the file name for KRIS getting knighted, so maybe we can check the file name for the slash. Maybe there will be a clue. And the file name says... Roaring Knight. Well, that is definitely a pretty huge blow to this theory, but it's right there, I can't deny it. Some part of me still wants to believe the KRIS slash interpretation because of all the evidence surrounding it and how it feels like the most logical and satisfying explanation of that scene. But maybe the simplest answer is the correct one. Now I guess the file name isn't confirmation that it has to be this roaring knight, but it is very strong evidence in that direction. But maybe it's like how Tenna calls KRIS the roaring knight, where both KRIS and the knight we see are roaring knights according to the prophecy. You know, they do get knighted, Or maybe they just stuck with the Roaring Night naming convention for organization, so maybe we just wouldn't glean much from this naming convention. Or maybe I'm just coping because I still like this theory. Either way, I just wanted to put this theory out there, to let people know about this interpretation, and to let you come to your own conclusion. As for other counter evidence, I guess the fact that it's never brought up directly by Ralsei is a bit puzzling maybe? Now I can come up with explanations that are satisfying to me, just that Ralsei already knows what KRIS's deal is in terms of working with the Knight, and how they're leaving KRIS and the player to sort that out. But I get it if that seems like more of a reach than to just say the Knight was the one slashing them. I know it's a bit dirty to spend all this time talking about a theory and then throw the very damning counter evidence at the very end, but I still feel strongly enough about it to make this video anyways, so here it is. Thanks for bearing with me, even if this theory is a bit scuffed. Now, I want to hear what your guys' thoughts are about this information. Leave a comment, tell me your experience, share the video. Did anyone get the same interpretation as me with KRIS slashing on their first playthrough? Is this evidence compelling in any way, or does the Knight interpretation still seem like the right one to you guys? Was I able to change anyone's mind, or at least get you thinking about something? Now, I do want to take my time to comb over these new chapters in fine detail to put some more pieces together and construct some more expansive and interesting theories. Please subscribe if you want to see me solve some of the mysteries of Deltarune. Or if you're interested in fun indie game development or software development, also subscribe for that, because I'll be doing that. Thank you for watching, and have a nice day.